Have you ever wondered what it would be like to wake up every day, knowing that each sunrise could be your last? What if I told you there were men who lived exactly like that for months on end, sailing the most dangerous oceans in the world on vessels that looked more like floating coffins? It's 4 in the morning. The bell rings through the ship like a death knell. You awaken in a space smaller than a coffin, sharing a berth made of rotten planks with 3 other men. The smell, indescribable, a nauseating mix of rancid sweat, urine, feces, vomit, and something you'd rather not identify. Welcome to the life of an ordinary sailor in the 17th century. But wait, before we continue, can you imagine what the process of becoming a sailor was like back then? The answer will shock you. Most men didn't choose this life. They were literally kidnapped from taverns by Navy recruiters known as press gangs. They woke up drunk in stinking shipholds, already at sea, with no chance of return. Others were criminals who chose the sea over the gallows, and many bitterly regretted that decision. Now imagine this. You're locked inside a wooden structure about 30 meters long, violently rocking on waves that can reach 15 meters high. The lower deck where you sleep is less than 1.5 meters tall. You can't stand up for months. But what was the real personal space each sailor had? Brace yourself for this disturbing fact. Each man was allotted exactly 14 inches of width to sleep. 14 inches. Less space than you have in a modern single bed. And there were more than 200 men crammed into these conditions. The air was so foul that many would faint simply descending into the holds. The sails often had to be adjusted not for navigation, but to try to air out the lower decks before more men died of suffocation. Are you hungry? Of course you are. But would you be able to eat knowing what I'm about to tell you? A sailor's basic diet consisted of hardtack, rock-hard biscuits, salted meat that was often rotting, and a disgusting substance called burgoo, a mix of oatmeal, rancid fat, and when lucky, some unidentified chunks of meat. The biscuits were so hard they had to be broken with hammers. And here comes the detail that will turn your stomach. They were literally alive. Infested with worms called weevils, sailors developed the habit of banging the biscuits against hard surfaces to make the worms come out. But when hunger struck, and it always did, they simply ate the worms along with the biscuits. The free water. Stored in wooden barrels for months, it turned into a greenish, viscous liquid that tasted like rot. Many sailors preferred to drink their own urine. This is no exaggeration, but do you think hunger was the biggest problem? Oh, my dear friend, you are very wrong. After a few weeks at sea, something started happening to the sailors' bodies. First, their gums began to bleed. Then their teeth loosened and fell out. Sores appeared all over their bodies and simply wouldn't heal. The men grew weak, their legs swollen like balloons. It was scurvy, a disease that killed more sailors than storms, pirates, and naval battles combined. What they didn't know was that they only needed vitamin C. Something as simple as an orange could have saved them, but fresh fruit was an impossible luxury on voyages lasting months. Want to know something even more disturbing? The officers knew of effective treatments, but they were very expensive. It was literally cheaper to let sailors die and recruit new ones than to keep them healthy. Now close your eyes and imagine this. You're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean when a storm approaches. The waves grow to impossible heights, some reaching 20 meters tall. The ship is tossed like a toy in the hands of an angry child. You are tied to the main deck, trying to adjust the sails as winds of over 100 kilometers reach try to rip you off the ship and throw you into the black abyss of the ocean. With every wave that crashes over the deck, you swallow liters of salty water. Your lungs burn. Your hands, cut by the wet ropes, bleed incessantly. And you know that if you fall into the water, no one will try to save you. There simply is no way. During these storms, many sailors were literally torn apart. Ropes snapped, like whips, striking men with enough force to break bones. Masts fell, crushing anyone in their path. And the screams. The screams were drowned out by the roar of the wind and waves. But what if you thought about rebelling, questioning orders? Well, let me tell you about 17th century naval justice. The whip was the most common form of punishment. We're not talking about a few symbolic lashes. Men received hundreds of lashes that literally tore the flesh from their backs. Many died during the punishment, and their bodies were simply thrown overboard. For more serious crimes, there was keel hauling, a punishment so barbaric even pirates considered it extreme. The condemned was tied to a rope that passed under the ship. He was then dragged from one side to the other, passing beneath the keel. The barnacles and hull encrustations shredded his skin. Most drowned before reaching the other side. And the most shocking, these punishments were applied for crimes such as insubordination, something as simple as questioning a stupid order from an incompetent officer. Think you've heard the worst? Prepare to learn about the true horror of diseases on board. Besides scurvy, ships were veritable breeding grounds for deadly diseases. Typhus, dysentery, yellow fever, malaria, all spread like wildfire in the confined and unsanitary environment of the vessels. When someone fell ill, isolation was impossible. The disease spread throughout the ship in a matter of days. Men defecated blood, vomited relentlessly, and deliriously burned with fever, yet they continued working until they literally dropped dead. The ship's doctors were often butchers or barbers with no real medical knowledge. Their tools? Dull knives, rusty saws, and a bottle of rum for anesthesia. Amputations were common, performed on the main deck while the conscious patient was held down by other sailors. How many men do you think died on a typical voyage? The answer will chill your blood. On long voyages, it was normal for 50% or more of the crew to die before returning. 50%. Imagine boarding with 200 men and returning with only 100. And that was considered a successful trip. The bodies were wrapped in canvas when available and thrown into the sea after a brief ceremony. But often, when deaths became too frequent, bodies were simply stacked on the deck until there was time to dispose of them. What disturbed sailors the most was not death itself, but the casual way it was treated. A man could be chatting with you in the morning and be fed to the sharks by afternoon, and life simply went on. Interestingly, encountering pirates was almost a relief compared to the rest of the voyage. Why? Contrary to what movies show, most pirates were former sailors who had deserted precisely to escape the horrible conditions of the merchant or naval marine. They knew exactly what you were going through. Many pirate attacks ended with the attacked, crew being invited to join the pirates, and believe me, many gladly accepted. Pirate life, despite all the risks, offered better conditions, better food, and most importantly, a chance to survive. Pirates had codes of conduct, democratic profit sharing, and treated their wounded. That's right, pirates offered better working conditions than the respectable naval companies of the time. But let's suppose you were one of the lucky ones who survived the voyage. What awaited you on return? After months or years at sea, many sailors came back completely changed, and not for the better. Constant exposure to sun and salt caused premature aging. Vitamin deficiencies left permanent damage. Many returned crippled, sick, or mentally disturbed by what they had experienced. And the pay they risked their lives for? Ship owners often found excuses not to pay the full wages, deduction for food, fine for damaged equipment, medicine fee. There was always a reason to reduce the pay. Many sailors returned poorer than when they left, with no prospects for work on land. So desperate, they signed up again. It was a vicious cycle that often ended only in death. Here's the question everyone avoids. If conditions were so horrible, why did ships keep finding crews? The answer is simple and disturbing, because life on land for most people was almost as bad. Hunger, disease, extreme poverty, these were the everyday realities of life in the 17th century. At least at sea there was a chance to earn some money and maybe improve their lives. Besides, the horror stories rarely reached the ears of potential sailors. The only stories that circulated were about adventures, treasures, and exotic lands. The brutal reality was carefully hidden by recruiters. So after everything you've read, do you still think you'd have the courage to embark on one of these voyages? The truth is that ocean exploration in the 17th century was literally built on the bones of hundreds of thousands of anonymous sailors. Every trade route established, every colony founded, every map drawn cost human lives on a scale that's hard to comprehend. These men were not romantic heroes sailing in search of adventure. They were desperate people, often forced by circumstances, who paid with their lives and suffering for what we today call the golden age of navigation. When you see an old map or read about great maritime discoveries, remember, every line on that map was drawn with blood. Every route discovered cost hundreds of lives, and behind every great captain there were hundreds of sailors whose names were never recorded in history. The next time you complain about the conditions of your job, remember the 17th century sailors. You definitely wouldn't survive their life. The life of a sailor in the 17th century was not just hard. It was a death sentence, disguised as employment. And perhaps the most tragic part of this whole story is that many of these men never had a real choice. They were victims of a system that saw them as disposable parts in the great machine of maritime trade. Today, when we comfortably sail on luxury cruises or cross oceans on safe airplanes, we rarely stop to think about the human lives that were paid to make all of this possible. The story of the 17th century sailors is a dark reminder that human progress often comes at a terrible cost, paid by those who had no choice but to pay it.